Welcome, everyone. It's time to dissect the latest chaotic maneuvers in the global financial order and once again point out just how out of touch some policymakers are with reality. If you're following this channel, you know the drill. We're here to cut through the government spin and media echo chambers, exposing the core issues hidden beneath fancy headlines and colorful pie charts. Today, we have a juicy topic on our plate, and it revolves around Scott Bessent, the man likely to step into the role of Treasury Secretary under President-elect Donald Trump. Think we're just looking at another suit in Washington? Think again. This man built his career by pinpointing the exact moments when government's economic policies diverged sharply from reality, earning billions through bold market bets. Yet, if confirmed, he's about to confront a perfect storm. The U.S. fiscal situation spiraling out of control, interest rates rising, and debt levels rivaling those last seen during the days of World War II. We'll examine how Bessent's strategies might offer a temporary band-aid or if they're just a recipe for economic disaster. Let's not mince words. The U.S. fiscal trajectory is on a collision course with disaster, and Bessent would be inheriting what is arguably one of the worst fiscal situations in modern U.S. history. You don't need to be a partner at PIMCO or a hedge fund manager to see that something's deeply wrong here, folks. The basic math is horrifying. Federal borrowing is through the roof, with deficits expected to exceed 6% of GDP for the third straight year in 2025, and that's during a period of relatively strong growth and low unemployment. What happens in a recession? What happens if the Federal Reserve's prediction of slow future growth materializes? Simply put, the government is living on borrowed time and borrowed money. The deficit for 2024 was projected at $1.83 trillion, a staggering figure, and increasingly, a lot of this is just to service the debt itself. The Treasury spent more on net interest payments than the entire U.S. military budget in trading through sight. Let that sink in. For the first time in modern history, the cost of simply maintaining our debt exceeded $882 billion, over 3% of GDP. And the interest payments themselves are rising rapidly. If you think those figures are bad, imagine your own household trying to pay credit card bills with your entire income, while still borrowing more. It's not sustainable. But the political class has been playing kick the can for decades. They've been acting like fiscal crisis only exists in people's imaginations. Until, of course, it slams into real life like a freight train. The real question is, how did we get here? Well, over the past few decades, both Democrats and Republicans have played fast and loose with fiscal discipline. We've seen generous spending, tax cuts that many traditional fiscal conservatives would balk at, and massive programs enacted on whims without serious efforts to pay for them. Now, Bessent finds himself stepping into an administration keen on extending Donald Trump's previous tax cuts, which account for a significant slice of the deficit problem. Think back to 2017 when Trump's tax package passed. Proponents at the time claimed it would supercharge growth to a point where the cuts would pay for themselves. Spoiler alert, they didn't. Fast forward to today, and federal revenue as a share of GDP has dropped to levels unseen in nearly 2 decades. Meanwhile, emergency spending tied to the COVID-19 pandemic added astronomical sums to the public debt. And if you thought that would be temporary, you're wrong again. Spending on healthcare, social security, and retirement benefits keeps ratcheting upward, showing that while politicians may escape election cycles with feel-good policies, the public debt doesn't. It's basically a competition to see which party can out-Santa Claus the other. Both parties, in their own ways, consistently push policies that are popular in the short term, tax cuts or spending programs, while pretending the long-term consequences of these decisions are someone else's problem. And long before Bessent trades in his Wall Street office for a stint in Washington, experts like Brian Riedel from the Manhattan Institute warned of what's to come. The hole is too deep to simply grow out of, and it's too significant to handle piecemeal. Unless we see dramatic, politically unpopular reforms, we're staring at a financial train wreck. So what's Bessent's plan to save the day? There's talk of having the deficit, cutting it to 3% of GDP by 2028. A noble goal, but the recipe is a familiar brew. 1. Further tax cuts, extending Trump's 2017 cut. 2. Deregulation, with hopes of spurring business investment. 3. Cheaper domestic energy, possibly through more fossil fuel extraction. When examined on paper, it all sounds great, right? Less red tape means business can move forward faster. Cheaper energy should lower costs for consumers, and tax cuts leave more money in your paycheck every month. But let's peel back the curtain. The moment those bonds get brought to market, which the U.S. Treasury auctions off regularly, investors expect returns. And when interest rates rise as we are seeing lately with 10-year treasuries yielding above 4%, higher servicing costs come with them. Unless Bessent can somehow force the hand of the bond market, this means more of our tax dollars will go into paying off investors rather than bolstering government services or even reducing the deficit. To make matters worse, the nonpartisan Congressional Budget Office, CBO, isn't convinced by the rosy assumptions. Their forecasts see persistent deficits around 6% of GDP well into the 2030s due to demographically inevitable spending like Social Security and Medicare unless something truly drastic changes. Even Jason Furman, former chair of the Council of Economic Advisors under Obama, is skeptical. His analysis shows that short of highly unlikely bipartisan reform to entitlement programs, Bessent's 3% goal will remain a pipe dream. Now, let's complicate things a little further. If you recall, we recently witnessed an unforgettable financial crisis in the UK under Prime Minister Liz Truss. She tried to push through tax cuts without adequate funding, triggering a market panic that led to the collapse of her government. Truss's plan wasn't all that different from some of Trump's ambitions: spur growth through deregulation and tax cuts. So why is this relevant? Because the bond market isn't infinitely patient. Remember 2022 in the UK, when yield spikes triggered mass selling of government debt? That scenario could very well play out in the US, if the deficit trajectory and fiscal strategy spook investors. Just ask Gene Boyman, head of the BlackRock Investment Institute, who has sounded the alarm recently about the risk of U.S. yields breaking above 5%, precisely the sort of event that could start a market death spiral, as J.D. Vance put it. Take note, this isn't all conjecture. It's pieced together from real events in real markets, from the UK to Japan to the US itself. There are already signs of fraying confidence in US debt. Major asset managers like Pacific Investment Management Co. PIMCO, which controls almost $2 trillion, have recently expressed hesitance to buy long-term treasuries. The Federal Reserve itself labeled the U.S.'s ballooning debt load as perhaps the single greatest threat to financial stability in its most recent report. Inflation may no longer be the flashy pen problem it seemed to be back in 2022. The stickiness in price growth adds layers of complexity to solving the deficit issue, as rising prices often force the Fed to keep interest rates higher for longer. While BESSENT'S plan relies heavily on his pro-growth policies freeing the economy, these economic headwinds are unavoidable. Monetary tightening isn't as accommodating as in previous decades. We'd be remiss not to explore the congressional reality under which BESSENT will have to operate. It's no secret that Trump's relationship with Congress can best be described as rocky. Add to that the typical dysfunction of U.S. legislative processes, and you quickly realize BESSENT might not have the latitude to enact even half of what he envisions. Think back to the gridlock and wrangling that accompanied past attempts to pass significant fiscal reforms, such as the Affordable Care Act, or more recently, the challenges faced in extending the debt ceiling. Add in defense spending, another sacred cow for many lawmakers, and the picture becomes even murkier. $874 billion is allocated to defense in the 2024 budget that's nearly historically untouchable. With razor-thin majorities in both chambers, just a few dissenting voices in the GOP or from the Democrats in the Senate could torpedo his proposals. Let's not forget that tax reform, especially of the type BESSENT might well champion, is legislative quicksand, and all of this operates against a backdrop where entitlement reform is politically radioactive. Despite serious attempts in the past, no president has managed significant reforms to Social Security or Medicare in meaningful ways that get leverage over long-term costs. Whoa. Ah yes, the elephant in the room, interest payments on the national debt. $882 billion in net interest payments surpassed even what we spend on defense for the first time in fiscal year 2023, and this is only going to get worse as debt levels rise and interest rates inch higher. Let's be very clear here, this is not sustainable. The U.S. is sitting on a debt load of around $37 trillion and climbing a figure roughly equivalent to more than 100% of U.S. GDP. We're not just talking about abstract numbers in a spreadsheet. These hefty interest payments are real dollars siphoned away from crucial investments in infrastructure, education, or other areas that might support long-term growth. As the Treasury continues issuing more bonds to cover past debt, it's also having to refinance debt at much higher interest rates than when much of this debt was originally issued. While the average interest rate on outstanding debt is around 3.3%, some new bonds are now offering yields above 4% and nearing 5%. Coupled with the fact that the Federal Reserve isn't likely to return to an ultra-low-rate environment anytime soon, we're now entering the realm of unsustainable interest burdens. A few years from now, it's quite possible we'll be talking about interest payments alone eating up over $1 trillion annually. And here's the problem. Once you're spending that much just to stay afloat, your options for fixing the deficit become incredibly limited. To put it into simpler terms, when you're borrowing just to pay your creditors, you're in serious trouble. It's like holding a credit card balance so large that the interest alone is breaking the bank every month, and all you're doing is taking out new credit lines to pay the interest on the old debt. Except in this case, the scale is unimaginable. Every year that passes without significant fiscal reform just adds more debt to the pile, which adds even more interest next year, compounding the problem exponentially. So what is BESSENT'S solution? If we take a close look at his blueprint, cut deficits through further tax cuts, deregulation, and cheap energy production, one must ask, will these levers actually deliver? Here's where the skepticism lies. BESSENT is looking at boiling the ocean to bridge the deficit gap to 3% of GDP by 2028. A big part of his strategy revolves around accelerating economic growth. Makes sense, doesn't it? If the economy grows faster than the debt, the relative size of the debt shrinks. But in this scenario, the key word is if. Tax cuts, extending Trump's 2017 ones, might look good on paper for boosting economic activity in the short term, but the evidence suggests they're less effective if deficits are already ballooning. Without a doubt, they're popular, especially for businesses and higher-income earners, but tax cuts do not always pay for themselves through increased growth. The gap-to-growth graph doesn't seem quite so optimistic when looking at how much tax revenue the government actually lost since those 2017 cuts. Then there's the touted deregulation push. It's the Republican playbook of leaner government and reduced red tape to spur business investment. But let's be honest, massive deregulation by itself may not be enough to close the huge fiscal gap. The financial markets, technology, and other key industries have already evolved within the framework of existing regulations. While some efficiency gains could stem from paring down environmental or labor regulations, for instance, it's naive to think that deregulation alone will swiftly counterbalance trillions of dollars of accumulated liabilities. Now, on energy production, the administration is likely looking at boosting domestic oil and gas output to bring down energy costs and stoke broader growth. It's worth noting that cheap energy is an important economic driver, especially given its knock-on effects on industries reliant on heavy energy input. Yet with the global push for green energy, coupled with the climate-focused policies of previous administrations, there's no easy path forward here. Any policy shifts to ramp up fossil fuel production could face fierce opposition, both from environmental groups and even financial sectors increasingly driven by ESG, environmental, social, and governance priorities. Trump's tariff and trade policies, which BESSENT reportedly believes could stimulate jobs and demand for domestic products, are a double-edged sword. Tariffs might give a short-term boost to certain industries, but they risk inflating costs for consumers and escalating trade wars, slowing economic growth in the long run. Energy independence through domestic fossil fuel production may help cut energy costs and reduce reliance on foreign oil, but it's still unclear if this strategy can grow the economy fast enough to close the fiscal gap or adequately offset the staggering interest costs. In essence, BESSENT is pinning his fiscal repair hopes on a delayed payoff from pro-growth policies. While deregulation, tax cuts, and energy production are popular conservative strategies, they have a track record of being overpromised and underdelivering when it comes to solving deficits, especially when the hole is this big. Now let's talk about the biggest fiscal elephant in the room: entitlements. Politically, these are considered untouchable, but make no mistake, you cannot solve a budget deficit of this magnitude without making structural changes to Social Security, Medicare, and Medicaid. Entitlement programs consume an increasingly larger portion of the budget as America ages. The Social Security and Medicare trust funds are on unsustainable paths, with projections showing the Social Security Trust Fund will exhaust by 2034, leading to automatic benefit cuts unless Congress intervenes. At the same time, Medicare continues to face massive deficits as 68 million enrollees push the system to its financial limits, and this number will increase as the baby boomer generation continues to retire. Add to that, healthcare costs in the US continue to outpace inflation, and email spent on healthcare for a beneficiary today is costing more than it ever has before. These entitlement programs are fiercely defended by aging voters, making bipartisan reforms extremely difficult. And no administration, Democrat or Republican, has shown much willingness to tackle this political minefield head-on. Yet if these programs remain unreformed, the cost explosion all but guarantees deficits will increase, regardless of how many tax cuts or deregulation policies are enacted. As Jason Furman noted, fixing the deficit without addressing entitlement reform is akin to solving cancer without treating the tumor. You can trim around the edges all you want, cut discretionary spending here, or shuffle some tax rules there, but unless you address the big three: Social Security, Medicare, and Medicaid, deficit reduction remains a fantasy. So where does this leave us? The core issue is that markets are forward-looking. If investors sense that the US is unwilling to confront its fiscal realities, they may react long before policy responses can materialize. This crisis isn't some abstract concept that can be kicked down the road indefinitely. If markets lose faith in US debt, if yields unexpectedly spike like they have in previous fiscal debacles, remember the 1990's Mexican peso crisis, or the European debt crisis of the 2010s, it could unravel much more quickly than anybody anticipates. Another risk is the politically paralyzed Congress. With Washington entirely dysfunctional, don't expect any serious reforms on entitlement spending or taxes during an election year. With Trump-backed representatives in one corner yelling for tax cuts and progressive Democrats demanding new spending on healthcare and green energy, the gridlock is likely to persist. Any reforms will be piecemeal and politically expedient rather than comprehensive. The hope for a bipartisan grand bargain looks bleak. Think about it. Trump rode into office in 2017 with Republicans controlling both houses of Congress, and even then, the administration only managed to pass a lopsided tax reform package. Since that time, both parties have moved even further apart ideologically, which limits room for bipartisan consensus necessary for entitlement reform or significant tax code changes. So here's where we stand. Best case scenario. BESSENT might, through a combination of tax tweaks, deregulation, and growth-sparking fiscal maneuvers, slightly reduce the deficit before 2028. Worst case scenario. Rising interest rates, congressional gridlock, and bond market backlash could threaten U.S. financial credibility, leading to higher costs of borrowing and exacerbating the very deficit he hopes to have. Discretionary cuts alone won't fix this mess, and the real fiscal fix lies in tackling entitlements, which, as we've discussed, is politically hazardous. Investors know this, too. Any failure by the U.S. government to address systemic issues will likely sour confidence in U.S. debt markets. Once that happens, no Treasury Secretary, not even Scott Bessent, could contain the fallout. It's no longer a matter of whether there will be pain or not. The question is how much pain there will be and how quickly it will hit. We're on the cusp of a profoundly dangerous financial moment. Will Bessent's vision pull us back from the brink? Or is the U.S. economy simply waiting for the gravity of its debts to finally pull us all down?